Clint Eastwood sat in his dimly lit study, running his fingers over an old yellowed letter. The ink had faded, but the words still burned in his mind. It was from John Wayne, the Duke himself. A letter written decades ago, but one Clint had never dared to open. Until now. His hands trembled as he unfolded the fragile paper. The moment his eyes landed on the first line, his breath hitched. "Clint, if you're reading this, I ain't around anymore. But there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you long ago. The world thinks they know me, but there's a secret I carried to my grave. And you, my friend, are the only one who can set it right." Clint's heart pounded. John Wayne, the legend, had taken a secret to his grave. And why had he chosen Clint, the man Hollywood had once seen as his rival, to reveal it? He had to know. And so he read on. Clint's fingers tightened around the fragile letter. He had admired John Wayne despite their differences. Hollywood had always painted them as rivals, Wayne, the old guard of westerns, and Eastwood, the rebellious gunslinger who redefined the genre. But Clint had never seen it that way. He took a deep breath and continued reading. "I know people think I was the toughest man to walk the West, but the truth is, I was afraid, Clint. Not of bullets or bad men, but of something much worse. And that fear cost me something I can never get back. Maybe it's too late for me, but it's not too late for you." Clint frowned. John Wayne? Afraid? It didn't seem possible. The Duke was the very definition of courage, but something in his words told Clint this wasn't just an old man's regrets. This was a warning. Wayne had always been larger than life, a man who never backed down. What could have haunted him so deeply that he carried it to his grave? And why was he telling Clint now? The next few lines hit Clint like a gunshot. "There was a man, Clint, a man I should have saved. But I didn't, and it has haunted me every day since." Clint's pulse quickened. This wasn't just some dying confession. This was unfinished business. And for some reason, Wayne had passed it to him. He kept reading. Clint's eyes scanned the next lines, his heartbeat loud in his ears. His name was Thomas Grayson, a cowboy, a drifter. But more than that, he was a good man, a better man than me. We rode together once, long before Hollywood made me John Wayne. Clint's grip on the letter tightened. He had never heard of Thomas Grayson. This wasn't some Hollywood name. This was real. Thomas saved my life. Twice. And when he needed me most, I turned my back on him. Clint leaned forward, feeling the weight of Wayne's words. The Duke wasn't confessing to some minor regret. This was something deeper, something that had eaten away at him for years. Thomas was wrongfully accused of a crime he didn't commit. They were going to hang him, Clint. And I could have stopped it. But I didn't. I let fear rule me. I told myself it wasn't my fight, that if I spoke up, I'd ruin my career before it even started. So I stayed quiet, and I watched them string up an innocent man. Clint exhaled sharply. John Wayne, America's symbol of justice, had once failed to stand for it. Every night since, I've seen his face. I hear his last words. "I thought you were a man of your word, Duke." Then the rope snapped tight, and I just stood there. Clint swallowed hard. The world knew John Wayne as a hero, but this letter revealed something no one had ever seen, the burden of a man who had once failed to be the hero he played on screen. And now Wayne was passing this burden to him. "Clint, I can't undo the past. But you still have time. Thomas had a family. Somewhere out there, his blood still lives. I never had the guts to make it right. But maybe you do." Clint set the letter down, his chest tightening. He had spent his life playing men who fought for justice. But this was real. Was he willing to carry out Wayne's final wish? Clint sat in silence, staring at the letter. The weight of John Wayne's words pressed against his chest like a loaded six-shooter. Thomas Grayson, wrongfully accused, hanged, forgotten. And now, decades later, it fell on Clint to set things right. He ran a hand through his silver hair, his mind racing. How do you clear the name of a dead man? How do you find justice for someone who's been buried by time? Clint knew one thing. He wasn't the type to let things go. If John Wayne had carried this regret to his grave, then it was now Clint's burden to carry forward. There was only one place to start. 2 days later, Clint sat in a dusty records office in Carson City, Nevada. Piles of old documents surrounded him, the scent of aged paper thick in the air. He had called in a few favors, searching for any mention of Thomas Grayson. Hours passed. The sun dipped below the horizon. Still nothing. Then, finally, a breakthrough, a brittle newspaper clipping from 1931. Drifter hanged for bank robbery. Sheriff claims justice served. Clint scanned the article, his jaw tightening. Thomas had been accused of robbing a bank in Elko, Nevada, a town Clint had passed through 100 times. Witnesses claimed they saw him at the scene. But the article mentioned something else, a missing sheriff's report. Something inside Clint told him this wasn't just an execution. This was a cover-up. If Thomas had truly been innocent, then someone had wanted him silenced. And Clint was about to find out why. A name from the shadows. Digging deeper, Clint found a name buried in the case files. Sheriff Walter Kincaid, the man who had arrested Thomas, the man who had ordered the hanging, and the man who, as Clint quickly discovered, had a record dirtier than a cattle rustler in a sandstorm. Kincaid had been involved in multiple suspicious cases, people disappearing, evidence vanishing, but no one had ever connected the dots. Until now. Clint leaned back, exhaling. This wasn't just about John Wayne's regret, this was bigger. Someone had framed Thomas Grayson. And if Clint could prove it, he wouldn't just be clearing a dead man's name, he'd be exposing a hidden injustice. A fire lit inside him. John Wayne had been too late. But Clint Eastwood, he still had time. Clint wasn't just going to let this be another forgotten story. If Thomas Grayson had been framed, then somewhere, buried beneath decades of dust and silence, was the truth. His next stop was Elko, Nevada, the town where Thomas had been hanged. He arrived just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. It felt fitting, like the final act of a western that had been left unfinished. The town had changed over the years, but not much. The streets were quieter, but the ghosts of the past still lingered. Clint's first stop was the courthouse. Inside, he met an old archivist named Harold Pierce, a man who had been working in the records office for over 50 years. When Clint mentioned Thomas Grayson, the old man's face turned pale. "Why are you digging up that name?" Harold muttered. "Because it never should have been buried," Clint said, sliding John Wayne's letter across the desk. Harold hesitated before picking it up. His eyes moved slowly across the page, and when he finished, his hands trembled slightly. "I knew it," he whispered. Clint leaned in. "Knew what?" Harold swallowed hard. That Thomas was innocent, but no one ever dared say it. Clint felt his pulse quicken. "Tell me everything you know." Harold hesitated again, glancing over his shoulder as if checking for listening ears. Then, in a hushed voice, he said, "Sheriff Kincaid wasn't just a lawman. He was a thief. He and a group of men robbed that bank, but they needed a scapegoat. Thomas was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the man who could have cleared his name disappeared the night before the trial." Clint clenched his jaw. It was worse than he thought. Thomas Grayson hadn't just been falsely accused. He had been executed to protect a lie. Clint knew the only way to clear Thomas's name was to find someone who had been there, someone who had seen the truth. and there was only one man left alive who fit that description. Frank Kincaid, the sheriff's son. Frank had been a young deputy at the time of Thomas Grayson's hanging. Now he was an old man living on the outskirts of town. Clint drove out to his ranch, the gravel crunching beneath his tires. The house was small, worn down by time, but the light was on inside. Clint knocked on the door. After a long moment, it creaked open. Frank Kincaid stood there, his face weathered, his eyes wary. "You're Clint Eastwood," he said, his voice rough like sandpaper. "And you're the last man alive who knows the truth," Clint replied. Frank's grip tightened on the doorframe. "I don't know what you're talking about." Clint pulled out the letter. "John Wayne did, and so do I." Frank stared at the letter, his face darkening. Then, with a heavy sigh, he stepped aside. "Come in," he muttered. Clint crossed the threshold, knowing he was about to hear the final buried truth of Thomas Grayson, the truth that had haunted John Wayne for decades, and the truth that could finally set a forgotten man free. Frank Kincaid sat heavily in his old wooden chair, staring at the letter in Clint's hands as if it were a loaded gun. For a long moment silence filled the room, broken only by the ticking of an ancient clock on the wall. Then, finally, Frank exhaled and spoke. "You want to know the truth?" he muttered. "The truth don't change nothin' for Thomas Grayson. He's still dead." Clint's gaze hardened. "Maybe, but it'll change what people remember about him. And maybe, just maybe, it'll give you some peace before you go to your own grave." Frank let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Peace? Ain't had that in a long time." He leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly as he rubbed them together. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he confessed, "My father was a powerful man in this town. Everyone thought he was the law, but the truth is, he was the worst kind of outlaw. He robbed that bank with his men, and they needed someone to pin it on. Thomas was just a drifter, an easy target. No family, no money, nothing to fight back with." Clint listened, his jaw tightening. Frank's voice grew heavy. "There was one man who could have saved him, a rancher named Albert Monroe. He saw my father and his men leaving the bank that night, said he'd testify." Frank paused, his hands gripping the armrests. "The next morning, Monroe's house burned down. They found him inside, said it was an accident." Frank scoffed bitterly. "But we all knew the truth." Clint's hands curled into fists. He had spent his life in Hollywood playing men who fought against corruption, men who brought justice to the innocent. But this was real. Frank sighed. "I was young, scared of my father. I kept my mouth shut. I let an innocent man die." He looked Clint in the eyes. "I ain't asking for forgiveness, just telling you what you want to know." Clint's voice was cold, steady. "You still got time to do the right thing." Frank shook his head. "No one's going to listen to an old man confessing to a crime from half a century ago." Clint leaned forward. "You don't have to convince the law. You just have to tell the truth." For the first time, Frank Kincaid looked afraid. Not of Clint, not of the past, but of what speaking the truth would finally mean. After a long silence, he gave a slow, tired nod. "All right," he murmured. "Let's set it right." The next morning, Clint Eastwood stood on the steps of the Elko courthouse beside Frank Kincaid, a group of reporters gathered around them. Frank's voice, though aged and weak, carried more weight than any courtroom verdict. "I was a coward," he admitted. "I knew Thomas Grayson was innocent. I knew my father was the real criminal, and I let it happen. But today, I'm telling the truth. Thomas Grayson was no outlaw. He was a good man, and he deserves to be remembered that way." The words spread like wildfire. Within days, the governor of Nevada issued an official pardon for Thomas Grayson, a man who had been wrongly executed nearly a century ago. It wasn't justice. Justice would have been saving Thomas before the rope tightened around his neck. But it was something, and sometimes something was all a man could do. A week later, Clint returned to his home, the weight of the past still lingering in his chest. As he sat down in his study, he pulled out John Wayne's letter once more. He read the last line, the words hitting him differently now. "Clint, I failed to be the man I played on screen. But you still have time. Be the man the world believes you are." Clint exhaled, folding the letter carefully. John Wayne had carried regret to his grave, but he had given Clint the chance to do what he never could, and Clint had done it. Thomas Grayson's name was no longer a stain in history. The Duke's final wish had been fulfilled, and in a way it felt like the last ride of an old cowboy finally finding his peace. Clint stood looking out the window at the vast open sky. Maybe, somewhere out there, John Wayne was tipping his hat in thanks. The end.